an abbreviated version of what the Bible is all about, especially the part where it's referred to throughout history as the greatest story ever told. And we know today is celebrated as the birthday of Jesus Christ, our Lord. But where did it all begin? And as usual, when we talk about anything or anyone or anybody or any event happening, we go back to the Bible. And the Bible starts off with the paraphrase of the words of God saying, "Gosh, this is great. I look out here all around me, and what do I see?" And he sees a few angels there in heaven and a few created beings there where he is holding court. And he looks out around him, and all he finds is a big void. There's nothing there. This sort of perplexes him. And he thinks about it for maybe that long. Sometimes your mechanical parts of the body don't work like they used to. But he thought about it, and suddenly he got a little bit angry and spoke with a louder voice than he normally would. And he said, and the words came out like boom. And he looked around, and then what did he see? The first day he saw that he had created a new vision, a new world. So this is the way the Bible puts it. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. And he spoke loud, and we had the beginning of our all existence as we know it. And it covered first day, second day, third day, and he created everything. The heavens, the stars, the planets. In fact, out of nothing, and with just a loud voice, he created this. So if you ever ask by anybody, how did the earth get created? Even the scientists that claim a big boom have to come down to the final point, who created the boom? Well, God himself did. But it was on about the sixth day, it was still just what we would call inanimate objects around him. Oh, we had, like I said, the heavens, the stars. So he created an image from the dust of the ground. He picked up a handful and molded a being. And he called this being Adam, which means the first man. And he made him in his own image. And he did this because it's hard for you to imagine, but we could put it this way. God was a little bit lonely. He had the angels, and he had the cherubs, and he had the seraphims, and he had all of these inanimate people that he could talk to. But he created man in his own image, and he put him out in this wonderful new creation that we refer to as the earth. And he put him into a place that was ideal. Garden of Eden. All we know about the Garden of Eden is that it was created by God when he created the rest of the beauty around him. And then Adam got down there, and Eve showed up, being made from a rib in Adam's side. Notice it was made from his side, not from his feet and not from his head, but where Adam went, Eve went, and they were coexistence in importance because she came from Adam. And they were put in Eden. And you have to just imagine Eden, because it was a place where God asked nothing of them. In fact, God asked nothing of any of us except for one thing. With Adam and Eve, he said, you can do anything you want in this place of plenty. And the place of plenty had all types of unimaginable foods and things like that that would give substance to Adam and Eve. And he said that you can have anything that you want, except do not eat from this tree of knowledge. We call it a tree. We don't really know. That's the way the Bible refers to it. And the tree of knowledge was the only restriction that God placed upon Adam and Eve. So God created a perfect world. Everything he did was perfect, was the best that it could be. And people like to say, well, you know, things didn't work out too well. That means that God created something imperfect. No, God created a perfect individual. But in his own wisdom, he decided that he did not want a non-animate object that he had created to sit around there and just agree with him and say, yes, Father, and everything that God himself said. He gave them freedom of thought and freedom of expression. In other words, he gave them a chance to do what they wanted to with this place he placed them. But God knew ahead of time that what he had created, once he gave them freedom of thought and expression, which he think they needed in order to converse with him, that eventually it would go wrong. It went wrong. Adam disobeyed the command, and then, as now, when anything in a marriage goes wrong, we always look upon that marriage and say, it was that woman that led Adam astray. We hear that expression today. But remember, God made them equal, and equal to enjoy and equal to suffer the blame. The mistake Adam made was not in listening to Eve, but trying to blame her for him eating the apple. God gave him the freedom of choice, remember, and Adam freely made that choice. Well, to make a long story short, God, who could not talk or exist around sin itself, and he kicked him out of the Garden of Eden, this place where it was just made for them. And he put them out into a world where now they had to face the consequences of living in a place that didn't exist the years before. Now, we don't know how many years Adam and Eve spent in the Garden of Eden. The Bible doesn't tell us. It could have been any time from the time when God picked up on that sixth day and molded them into the creatures, human beings that they were. Might have been 1,500 million trillion years. In other words, it could have been as long as we talk about from today throughout eternity. Treating today as if it was always been there. And we don't know how far the end of eternity is as far as days and all. So Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. God at this time knew that he could not converse with them as he had while they were living in the Garden of Eden, because there they were sinless. There was no sin in the world. But the minute that Adam tasted of that fruit of his own free will, God found out that he could not walk into the garden with them. And so he had to find another place for them, and he kicked them out of the Garden of Eden and put the cherubs there to guard it so that they could never walk back into it again. But God has always been a forgiving God. And he let Adam and Eve go out into existence. And they, they enjoyed each other and created the world as it has finally turned out and we know it today. And God was able to converse with them while they were out of the Garden of Eden, not physically like he had when they were there, but because they had been his creation and they had been the people that he set up to take care of. He always offered a second chance. And he had preparations made then with his son, that eventually his son had to figure out a way to help them get back into the good graces of God. In other words, his son would be born to take their sins upon his shoulders so that he could talk to them again and converse with them as he wanted to. Well, like I said, I'm paraphrasing this. Time went on by. Some of the people that grew out of this early wedding eventually did wrong, and they kept doing wrong like Adam and Eve have. And we all know the story of Moses going up on the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, and how while he was up there, the people that he had been sent down to free the slaves at that time from Egypt, the Jewish slaves, and it all turned around, and every day there was something going wrong with whom he had set out to populate the world. Again, years passed. Eventually, things had to be made right. God put down since he could not converse personally because of them being sinful with Adam and Eve, he had prophets put down to help guide them in the direction that he hoped that would eventually take over Adam and Eve and get them back into his good graces. Well, what happened? They listened to the prophets for years. There was no mention of kings or queens or any other leaders. Moses was a prophet. After the prophets, we had to live through the judges. This was a secondary group that the Lord gave to the people to keep them going in the right direction. Where the prophets, being human, they convinced a few people and unconvinced some others. Sin grew and prospered among all the populace. And after the prophets had proved to be, not exactly what the world needed, because the people then saw other nations around them. I'm talking about the Jewish people that God had created Adam and Eve with, and who later on, through Abraham, was going to give them the possibility of creating another Garden of Eden type of place. So they made the mistake of owning kings and queens. And Saul was their first king. They picked him, and he bombed out. David became the one chosen by God to lead his people. And David was a man of his own choosing and was greatly loved by God and was a great one to take the world in the direction he wanted it to go. But David, being human, had a few faults. And so the leadership of the Jews, because they had sinned under David, with all of his many sins that he had at the time, sins which incidentally, to set up what was going to happen to everyone if they made the choice. If you sin and admit it and apologize and tell the Lord and pray for forgiveness, He's going to forgive you. He don't just forgive you, He forgets. Well, David went through this cycle for lots of times. His chosen son to succeed him ended up doing the same type of conditions and stresses and strains that he put the world in, that the good Lord said, I can't allow this to go on. So he destroyed the Jewish nation as a group of people. This was the group that he had promised was going to be world-shaking and the leaders of everything. And one of them, David, did accomplish one real good thing for the Lord. He named Jerusalem. In fact, he captured Jerusalem and made that the capital of Israel. Up until then, the capital of Israel was not Jerusalem. But they had sinned as a country now, and God punished this sinning by completely destroying the combination of tribes that made up the country of Israel. And after Solomon's son was the last one that came into power as a king of the undivided Israel. Israel divided into two parts at that time, with Judah and Israel in the northern part, and Judah in the south. If this went on for years and the Jews became scattered, the Jewish people became scattered throughout the world and did not exist as a tribe or a country anymore. After the Assyrians first came there, probably 500 BC. I'm talking about 500 years in our way of counting, and after the time that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. That was probably 10,000 years after that occurred. The Assyrians kicked them out, and the Jews as a people did not exist again as a country until 1948, when they were gathered together again, because as the prophets had promised through God through the prophets, that there would always be a remnant of the Jewish people, and eventually they would be brought back together again. That's what they were prophesying. That was the leaders that had been chosen by them. Well, in 1948, they became Israel again, and they started worrying about the rest of what God had promised Abraham. Were they going to become the focal point of the entire world? Would eventually Jerusalem become, notice the word Jerusalem. When they first existed, Jerusalem was not their capital. But David had captured it and made it the capital. And later again, after they lost their capital being there in Jerusalem, it took effect probably a couple of years ago that Jerusalem was acceded to be the capital of Israel. Wasn't being ruled by the Israelites at the time, but it is now. And a couple of the prophets prophesied about this is not going to go on forever. And one of them happened to be Isaiah. And I'd like to read you what Isaiah said about the fulmination of the Jewish people. Isaiah, well, he told them that the good Lord is just angry with everything going on the way it's been going on, and that one day there would be a replacement, a Messiah. And they all said, what is a Messiah that you're promising us to come in? And Isaiah told them, in effect, that the Messiah was going to be the one person that was going to free them from their punishments of the past. See, now at that time, the Jewish people used to have all of these sacrifices. This was ordained by when Moses came down from the mountaintop. They were to give the sacrifices back to the Lord in atonement. And this Messiah was going to be an individual, a human being that God had picked out so that he could come and take on upon all of the sins of the Jewish people and do away with their sacrifices that they were really having problems with at the time. Because now, at the replacement of an unscarred animal, a pure, clean lamb was killed for their sins. So the Messiah was going to take the place of all the sacrifices that they were having to make at that time to the Lord, which they were doing it incorrectly, because now the rabbis would gather in some of the animals close in and around the synagogue, and they could have been diseased or crippled or maimed or whatever, and they sold them to the Jewish people that came there once a year to atone for their sins by killing one of the sacrificial lambs. This went on for a while, and nobody paid much attention to this particular prophecy of the prophet. But then a multitude of the prophets kept predicting the same thing. And again, we're talking about 500 BC. Doesn't sound like a great time. But they came across the prophet Daniel. And Daniel had, the story, and we won't go into that, about being one of the captured Jews that was sent off to Babylon when the Assyrians came in and finally conquered Israel and Judah in the south. And Daniel was a favorite there and had been adopted by the king of that area as a prophet because he could read dreams and things. But the angel Gabriel came to Daniel, and he made 2 trips, and both trips virtually said the same thing. So I'll talk about the last trip. Daniel was getting up in age. He was probably in his 80s or 90s, a time when the older folks then had pretty much died off. And he still had one thought about, well, what about the Jewish people? Remember he had been made a captive. And the angel Gabriel told him this story. Really, it was a prophecy about what was going to happen to the Israelites. And he basically told him that you're going to go through 490 years of punishment, of being scattered, of being treated secondhand, and then this, in their terminology, was called 70 weeks, each week being 7 years, which comes out to 490 years. Well, Daniel was sort of worried about it because some of the things that were being prophesied had already begun to take effect, but the Jewish people had not been affected very much. History records that this prophecy began at the time when the first walls of the northern tribes of Israel were breached by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Persians. They were all one group of people, and each one followed the other king with attacks against the Jews. That sounded pretty bad, but got to figuring it out, and Daniel said, well, I'm still worried about it. And the angel said, well, you know, I was late coming to you because you prayed so diligently that God our Father wanted me to come to you again and reiterate our earlier promises that the Jews would be reconstituted and things would take place and there would be a man that would conveniently destroy all of their enemies as a time, like they did in the beginning when he said, boom. In other words, there was going to be a new Jerusalem. And Daniel said, well, that's good, but I'm worried about it. And the good Lord, he said, Daniel, I've told you what's going to happen. And why don't you just relax now and retire, and no more did we hear about Daniel. Well, 490 years dated from the time we talked about the wall being torn down. That ended in, instead of the 77 years, 70 periods of time, with each one being 7 years, about when Jesus was crucified on the cross. And that left one full week, what they used to call the 70 weeks of Daniel, 1 week or 7 years, where the punishment wasn't going to be inflicted upon the Jews. To this date, we're still waiting for that second period of 7 years. And the book of Revelation is about that 70th week, when all of this is supposed to take effect. And as things were going at the time, really you didn't hear any more about it. The prophets that we talked about that had been put down there were dying off. The kings that had been done away with and were dying off. And Israel was still not a country in existence. And then it died off. Again, in 1948, it came again, that they were made a recognizable country. But we're still in the period of time waiting for the last week of 7 years of Daniel's prediction about the Jews taking back over the world again. And we know that there's a bunch of things that have to happen before that time. But in the book of Revelation, we read what will actually take effect. And I personally think that with all the events that we've had relating to the weather changes, the temperature, and the earthquakes, and tornadoes, and the storms that were predicted that were going to be in that last 7 weeks, that we're probably approaching that time. What they are going to do, though, is in the book of Revelation, and we'll close with what they say then about the New Jerusalem. And the good Lord, at that time, and this will be after the prediction of the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, when he come down and conquered, not with the aid of anyone around him, not by aid from the United States or Russia, because they're not mentioned, but was able just by, as God had done when he started the world, this Jesus Christ will come with the second coming of Christ as a human being. All of this too had been predicted by the early prophets with the Messiah. They told about where he was going to be born, and we've all gone through the Christmas story, which was the story of the birth of Jesus Christ, the coming Messiah, from a virgin, the wife of Joseph, and being crucified and dead, died, and buried, and rose again from the dead and lives today. That was all prophesied. And that's yet to come in that last 7 weeks. And then we're going to see, when Jesus comes down, we're going to have a new heaven and a new earth. And Jesus tells John in the book of Revelation, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. But I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. In other words, the New Jerusalem will come down out amidst all this destruction. At that time, the world will be flat. The stars will be gone. The big boom will have occurred again. And the planets will be gone. And we will have a completed city coming down to earth and becoming the New Jerusalem. And this was in the words of Christ himself, who said, I go to prepare a place for you. And if it were not so, I would tell you. This was after he was crucified from the dead in the year 30 A.D. or 33 A.D. And we have been awaiting that second coming again. And God said, I shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death. Remember, this was one of the things that they gave up when they left Eden. They were not doomed to die ever while they were in Eden. But as Satan told Eve, surely God was not being truthful when he said he would kill you if you ate the pears from the tree or the fruit from the tree. Well, God does not lie. And there will be a New Jerusalem. And death did come to Adam and Eve. They lived out a normal life like all of us do today. It wasn't instantaneous death as Satan implied. But he finishes up by saying there'll be no more death. In other words, they will live forever after this time. They and their successors and those that have accepted Jesus Christ as the Messiah, which the church today asks you to do. And the church will have disappeared at that time because Jesus Christ himself will be the church. All the physical buildings saying church will have disappeared. And Jesus will be in the congregation talking to all of those that have accepted him as Messiah, both Jewish and Gentiles. And then at that time, the Gentile nations would have ceased to exist. And all that we will have will be the one group of people, those that are accepted by God to live in the new Garden of Eden. And that will finish out the 70th week of Daniel, the punishment that God was going to inflict upon the Jewish nation. And it will be the final determination. And before then, there will be worry and pestilence and disease. There will be all types of destructive things happening to them around them, but only to those that will not accept Jesus Christ as their Savior. God only asked of Eve and only asked of Adam that you do not eat of the tree of life. And Jesus will have fulfilled the promise that would do whatever Savior type of person has to do in the definition of the word. And that is, he does away with any blame attached to what